Welcome to another COVID and Beyond webinar. My name is Andrew Cardozo and I'm president of the Pearson Centre. As many of you will know, the Pearson Centre is a progressive think tank that addresses the major social and economic issues of the day. And in that context, we've been having a series of webinars on COVID and beyond. Today is webinar number 18. The past webinars are available on our YouTube channel, so just go to YouTube and type in Pearson Centre and you'll be able to see the past ones there. I want to take a moment to thank our two sustaining sponsors, who are Canada's Building Trades Unions and the International Association of Firefighters. Without their help, these series would not be possible. Today's webinar is entitled The Economics of Recovery. What is happening in Canada and what should we be doing? We have an amazing panel of economic and financial experts, and I will keep the introduction short so we can hear from them. But I want to say a few things that are just relevant to our discussion today. Angela McEwen is a leading Labour economist. She's the chief economist for the Canadian Union of Public Employees and is the past chief economist of the Canadian Labour Congress. Her primary focus is how Canadian and economic policies affect workers, climate policy, and international trade and investment treaties. Ian Lee is a professor at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University. He has taught executive MBA courses in a number of countries, including Poland, Russia, Iran, Ukraine, Argentina, and the US. He's frequently on various radio and television shows. Francesco Sorbara is a member of Parliament for Vaughan Woodbridge and is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Revenue. He is an economist by training and worked in the global financial markets in Canada and the US prior to entering political life. My co-moderator is Yasmin Ratanzi, Member of Parliament for Don Valley East. She is chair of the important Standing Committee on the Environment and Sustainable Development of the House of Commons. And I should mention, in a past role as chair of the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, she introduced the first report on gender lens budgeting. She is an accountant by training and is a fellow of the Chartered Professional Accountants. What an amazing panel of economists and financial experts. And I'm delighted to note that you have all been on the Pearson Centre podium before, so welcome back. With regards to the format, the panel discussion will last about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for Q&A with you, the audience. So please go to the question box on your screen and send in your questions as soon as you can. The session will end promptly at 3 p.m. In fact, perhaps 2:59. The session is being recorded, and it will be posted at the Pearson Centre YouTube channel later this afternoon and available by podcast shortly after. So I will pose the first question and then hand over to Ms. Ratanzi to take us from there on. So let me ask you all this question, and I'll start with you, Angela McEwen. Where are we at today? Can we assume that the worst of this pandemic has been, in terms of the economy, has been in March, April, May, and that things are now beginning to climb back with the help of various government supports and indeed the reduction of limitations of movement of people? What are your thoughts about where we're at today? Angela, you first.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair assessment. We saw such a huge immediate response as global economies shut down to contain the virus in March, and that shutdown lasted a little bit longer than maybe we thought it would at the time, and the recovery has been slow and will continue to be, I think, slow. We had a initial bounce back as retail stores and other things like that were opened up, but going forward we're going to have, I think, it's going to be a slower recovery as we're figuring stuff out. You've got schools coming back in September. We don't know what that's going to look like and how that's going to play out in terms of our ability to contain the virus. Will we have to close down other things, or will it be okay and it will kind of be a stepping stone on the return to normal? So I think there's still a lot of uncertainty ahead. but we can definitely say that that huge shock that we had probably won't be repeated. Yeah, that we've definitely got supports in place for workers and businesses, for most people, to help us recover.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Ian Lee, your thoughts on where we're at now?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the invitation to appear before your very distinguished institute. I'm going to echo and just expand a little bit on what Angela said. I think the stats coming out of Stats Canada, I'm talking the GDP stats, the labor, many people, not all people going back to work, have shown that the worst is behind us. But having said that, we took an incredible hit. I mean, the collapse was in March and April was almost vertical. I mean, if you graph it, it's not a ski hill, it's a cliff. We went over a cliff and just went straight down. We've recovered almost all the GDP from pre-COVID. We've got about 12% unemployment, about 4 million people. There's 19 million pre-COVID. There were 19 million people employed in Canada per Statistics Canada. And so a large number are back to work. But I think the tail, that 4 million left, it's going to be a lot tougher, and the recovery for those people are going to be a lot more protracted. It's not going to be like the first group, if you will, in the last couple of months where we saw a very sharp recovery. That it's going to be a much slower, longer recovery for the remaining 4 million. And I think, and just quickly to summarize on this point to finish up my part, I think we're seeing really the emergence of a bimodal economy. Some parts of the economy are doing just gangbusters. They're booming. I mean, look at Google and look at Amazon and companies like that. But then you look at the what I would call in-person server jobs and industries, restaurants, bars, airlines, gymnasiums, that sort of thing, where you're serving people in person. And some people are going back to restaurants, some people are going back to the gyms, some people are flying, but I think we're going to see those jobs recover much more slowly. And indeed, the IMF is suggesting 12% unemployment until at least the end of 2021 and into 2022.
Thank you. Francesco Cervera, your thoughts?
Thank you, Andrew, and obviously thank you for the invitation today, and to everyone at the Pearson Centre, thank you for your great work. Largely echoing what Angela and Professor Lee have commented. As an economist myself, usually you have 3 economists and you get 6 different views, but I think on this one we're sort of on the same page. You have had I would say a bounce back in terms of economic activity. The economy had to shut down because of the health concerns. Policymakers around the world had, put in place measures which basically had economic activity come to a standstill, and rightly so. So now we've seen, the numbers come out, and Professor Lee acknowledged that. So if you look at certain sectors of the economy, lumber prices are at an all-time high right now, or because everybody's doing home renovations. The housing market's recovered very swiftly. Consumer spending in July for the first time is now year over year on positive levels, and has recovered basically where we're higher that where we were at in February. So a lot of good indicators have come out. We've recovered, I think, about out of the 3 million jobs that were lost from the Stats Can numbers, and from what I read from the economist research out there, we recovered about 1.7 million, if my numbers if I'm right. We're still down about 1.3 million. We as a government, we're not going to rest until all Canadians are back to work and fulfilling their potential. What's important is what we've done as a government, but also from an economics point of view, is build a bridge and make sure that the health concern, put in the investments we need on the house side, but put in the bridges for the economic side. So the business account loan, CEBA, the Qs, the wage subsidy to maintain that employer-employee attachment, the CERB to help people replace their income. And if you look at the numbers, CERB payments totaled 60 billion for a 3-month period, March to May, versus the actual wage loss, which was about 40 billion. So we are helping Canadians. We are helping build that bridge to a quicker recovery. And I would argue, in reading some of the bank research that come out, our recovery, the numbers have actually been better than people anticipated just 2 or 3 months ago in terms of how fast recovery. But we still have a lot of work to do. But the numbers coming out are favorable directionally. They're positive. and the government has put in place those supports that, give, at the end of the day, I always say this, proper, get back that consumer confidence and get back that business confidence that we need so people can take risk to invest, create jobs, and grow the economy with the right social fabric in place to support all Canadians when they need support.
Okay, thank you. And Yasmin Ratanzi, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for your input into the question that Andrew asked you. My concern is that we are seeing some spikes in the COVID cases. Have we opened up the economy too fast? What about the programs? Professor Lee said, there is people have recovered. Yes, there were 8.6 million applicants for the CERB program. 4.1 million have already gone back to the labor force. But as an MP who is dealing with some of the most vulnerable population, the gig economy, etc., they are the ones that are finding it very difficult. And most of them, 56% actually, are women. And they are in the 5 categories: the caring, the catering, the cashiering, the clerical. And those are the ones that are not going to get their jobs back. So there is a stopgap measure that the government has brought in, and that's the Canada Recovery Benefit as well. I'd like your assessment of what is it that the government should do to help those people who are not eligible for CERB or CEWS. How should the government move forward? I'd like to start off with Angela, because for me, this is a woman's issue. It's a feminist agenda, and the women have been hit very hard. And you, being an economist in the labor movement, would probably have those statistics with you as well.
Yes. So what we have right now, women's labor force participation has fallen to levels not seen in 30 years. And part of that has been, as Ian said, we're seeing different industries impacted differently. So airline, you have a whole bunch of flight attendants, which are mostly women, that don't have any work. You have cashiers, you have servers in restaurants. So it is a lot of female-dominated industries that were laid off. And it was also the most vulnerable. So part-time workers, temporary, we saw those workers were the first ones to be laid off and not likely to have benefits. So all of a sudden they're without kind of income or support, which is why the CERB having a flat rate was so important. It allowed people to basically stay in their houses, right? Continue so that they didn't become homeless or really vulnerable in this situation. But as we pointed out, the restaurants aren't 100% back, and where they are back, it's more often there's more delivery than servers that are back. So there's still a huge impact. And then if we think about childcare centers, actually a whole bunch of childcare centers weren't able to stay open because they didn't have the funding to actually meet the higher requirements for safety and to have lower ratios. And so about 30% of childcare centers in Ontario are at risk of closing. And we already didn't have enough childcare spaces for people. So this is a huge problem on 2 fronts, where women need childcare in order to return to work, but they're also more likely to lose their jobs. So what governments need to do is, along the lines of what we've been hearing, continue to provide income support for people who, through no fault of their own, have lost their jobs, invest in childcare and safe returns to school, and really think about equality when you're designing your programs. Think about who has been the worst impacted and how are they going to be affected by these programs that you're putting into place. So so that the cliff of CERB ending and people not knowing what they're going to have after that, it's really important that we have the recovery benefit for workers that didn't pay into EI.
Professor Lee?
I'm going to agree and disagree with you, Yasmin, and I do agree with most of what Angela said. In fact, there's a larger theme running through these comments of the various people here, which is that we don't have, and we're getting to a theme I want to talk about soon, we don't have a universal problem in Canada. We have a select problem that's a very critical problem. Yes, it's affected women disproportionately. There are many industries that have not been negatively affected. In fact, some industries have actually been positively impacted, meaning their revenues and their profit and the demand for their industry went up, such as the renovation industry for lumber and that sort of thing. So in other words, we need to seek targeted solutions, not universal daycare, not universal guaranteed annual income, but target the people who need help rather than giving money to people like me or Angela who don't need any help whatsoever. So I agree with what the government has been doing, rolling the CERB and then the announcement the CERB is being transferred into the EI system, and that it's going to come up with 3, call it supplementary programs to address those people who are not going to come under the traditional EI rules. That's a very prudent response. I do agree with Angela. She may be shocked by this, but I do agree with daycare. I think we need a daycare program. Obviously, we may disagree that we should be giving it to high income people when we should be targeting it to people who need help. So I think the government's response has been prudent. It responded to the immediate crisis. I'm talking back in March. It sent everybody home because we didn't know the extent of the crisis and how deadly it was. And we provided, the government provided income support for all those people that lost jobs, which is very critical. And now going forward, I think there's going to be a need for much more surgical, targeted policy responses to those who actually are in trouble, those who need help, and not professors, not a chief economist at labor unions, not public servants on the job, because they're already looked after. But it's the people who have fallen between the cracks, and that's really been the history of our country. I mean, in the last 50 to 70 years, a more targeted approach. Every social program really in Canada, save and except healthcare, is really a targeted. You only get unemployment insurance if you're unemployed. We do have a pharmacare program.
You only get childcare if you have children, though, Ian.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It'll have to be surgical and targeted to address.
Surgical though. Childcare is surgical and targeted because all women need childcare and all parents need childcare. So it is quite targeted.
I'll jump in at this. I think this is a good time for Francesco to jump in. What I think one thing Angela said at the beginning, and it's a statistic in terms of, and I follow this very closely, employment rates and labor force participation rates and all those type of measures. I read my stats as an MPPS, as someone, but as an economist by training, as I have my CFA as well, and participate in the financial markets for nearly 20 years of my career. But as someone who grew up in a very small town, and mother worked at a cannery and dad worked at a pulp mill, very middle class in terms of my views, we need a strong social fabric. And with that, the labor force participation rate of women, which obviously took a negative hit, a very, very large hit, because of the nature of the pandemic, because of the nature of a lot of daycares having to shut down to now adjust to different sizes of how many children you could have in daycare, how they've reopened up. That is a crucial aspect of a full economic recovery, is seeing that labor force participation rate for women, allowing them to get into the labor force and allowing them choices in terms of what type of daycare they want to choose. We, for example, in one of our policy was we extended the maternity leave from 12 months to 18 months, and there have been a number of you've seen an uptick in women taking that opportunity as well. So there are different options out there, but it's very, very key that couples in whatever sense have that choice to make sure that both parents, or if the father wants to stay home or the mother wants to stay home, or whatever arrangement it is, that they can safely do that. There's an affordability factor with daycare as well, which is a larger issue and another discussion we could have for hours. So we do need to, I do agree with Ian in terms of the selective measures. I think, we have the Canada Child Benefit, Ian, which, as you know, is a means tested program. High income earners over roughly $220,000 do not receive the Canada Child Benefit, tax free if you at the lower levels. You're maxing out I think it's $7,000 per child, tax-free before taxes. It's actually quite a substantial sum, helping parents out. That's how we've been able to lift over 300,000 children out of poverty with those type of targeted measures, which are great. A universal child Canada benefit didn't work. You tax it at the end and it went to high income earners. The way we've done it with a targeted but very comprehensive program is a measure that I'm very proud of.
Thank you very much. And the targeted approach is what Ian, Professor Lee, I agree with you, and I agree with Francesco that the Canada Child Benefit has been very, very targeted. And I can say from my writing that we have lifted 9,000 families out of poverty. But COVID has exposed the underbelly of people who are in the gig economy, for example. And so my question is, I was looking at the OECD report and it was talking about a feminist agenda. And the question is going to you, Professor Lee, because it says that they're suggesting 1% of the GDP of any nation should go to early learning and child care. Now, Canada has invested $235 billion already. And being an accountant, and of course, prudent accountant, and I'm sure Francesco is a prudent economist as well, what would you say? Is this good investment? Are we going to increase deficits? What are your thoughts?
Are you referring just to daycare or our total spending on, let's call it the social envelope?
No, this is actually, the OECD was saying allocate at least 1% of the GDP to early learning and childcare, because as statistics and academics have told us that if you do not invest in early learning and childcare, then you do not get the educated population that you want. And so the poor will remain poor, the rich will get richer, and that margin is going to really drive us. So no, I am just looking at the first 1%.
Okay, sorry, whether it's 1%, I haven't read that research. I read a lot of OECD research. I'm not sure about the 1%, but the larger principle, I think, is this is an idea whose time has come. You know, we've been debating daycare, childcare, whatever we want to call it. I'm talking depending on the province, pre-4-year-old or pre-5-year-old. I think this idea has come. Its time has come. I think that there's increasing support across the political spectrum, across the generations in Canada. I think there's actually, in my personal view, I think there's far greater support for daycare or wherever we want to call it, pre-school care than there is for pharmacare, because we already have, I'm just comparing and contrasting. We already have pharmacare in Canada. We have actually 10 pharmacare programs at the 10 provincial governments. It's already paying 42% of all the prescription drugs in Canada. So we're well down that road. Whereas daycare or preschool care is the absence of it, or the cost of it, the costliness of it is handicapping those women who are lower marginal or moderate income, and it's stopping them from returning to the workforce. And we should be looking for, I completely agree, we want a high participation rate. We want as many people working as possible. If we want to get the economy going again, we got to get people back to work once we get past the COVID crisis. And I think that's the principal barrier today. And I say that as somebody, I have 2 grandchildren and who are 6 years old. And this is a problem that has been faced for the last 4 years by their parent, by the mother and the father. And it's a very real problem because it is so expensive. So we're going to have to come to terms and come up with some kind of a solution, while at the same time not providing the same support to somebody making $200,000 a year as only makes $30,000 a year. We've got to make that critical distinction that it's low-income people and modest income people that need the help, not professors and senior public servants and Superior Court judges and that sort of thing, and CEOs.
Francesco, you're next, and I'll give Angela the last word this time.
I can be try to be very brief on this. Childcare is a necessity to increase labor force participation rates for women. And to grow our economy, and then you can cite so many studies out there, having that accessibility and the affordability of childcare for those who need it, for those who want to utilize it, is a paramount for any serious policymaker in terms of looking to grow their economy, to encourage folks to, we need people having babies. We need, if you look at the demographics of many countries around the world, we need to ensure there's population growth. We need to ensure people have the choice and say, you know what, I can afford to have the second or third child, and daycare or childcare, whichever term you want to use, is a very critical component of it. In the province of Ontario, we have full day kindergarten and JKSK. I have a 7 and 9 year olds who went through. My wife and I are very well versed in terms of the cost, in terms of the waiting times for daycare, and then in terms of what happens when your kids get into JKSK, where there is that opportunity. And I think those discussions are very important discussions, because it's paramount to get that labor force participation rate of women up and higher and back to where it was. And even if we can grow it even more, that would be fantastic.
Angela, you've got the last word.
Well, thank you. Your original question talked about, is this a good investment? And so if you're talking about the return on an investment, there is no better investment than childcare. We've seen this in Quebec, where women's labor force participation increased enough that it actually repaid the initial investment by the government in taxes. And that's not even considering the benefit to the children, to the workers that you hire to provide that work. So it's mind-boggling to me that if this decision were actually being made on its financial merits, we would have done it years ago, because it makes financial sense in terms of, it's as important as roads and buses and bridges as infrastructure in the economy and getting people to work. And the reason that you have, I would just like to comment on Ian Lee's discussion about targeted versus universal. The reason that you provide that service as a universal service is for several reasons. First of all, if rich people's children are using that service, it's more likely to be high quality. There's going to be the shared social understanding that this is for all of us. We all care about it. When you target services, often they become underfunded and the quality suffers because the taxpayers, the people who are funding it, aren't using it, so they don't care. So it's really important to have that high quality childcare option available. And then you use a progressive tax system, so higher income earners pay for it through their taxes. And then you combine that with something like the targeted income support through the child tax credit, which gives more money to the low income families to meet some of their other needs, like food and shelter. And that allows families, first of all, it also responds more quickly to sudden changes. If you've all of a sudden lost employment or lost money, you still have that childcare option for you. You aren't all of a sudden scrambling to try to not meet the standards to get the subsidized care, because it can often take a long time to get into subsidized care. So it's more quick in responding to changes in people's income as well. So I think there's lots of really good economic reasons to have the public service be universal, but the income support be targeted.
Thank you. And it brings me to, I think our conversation is really going around, how do we alleviate poverty in Canada? And poverty comes lack of education, lack of job opportunities, and therefore, what do we do? And my question to the three of you, which program would you think would provide a safety net, a revisal of a renewal of the EI or changing to the EI program? Should there be a wage and income support program, or should there be a basic income program? And I'm going to start with Francesco this time, and then go to you, Angela, and Professor Lee, you will get the last word.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Yasmin. I'm going to take it from this context. I think the best poverty relief program is a growing labor force and a growing job market, first and foremost. I think that's the best thing we can do, is create the conditions for businesses to invest, for consumers to invest in themselves, in their human capital, for employers to invest in their employees' human capital as well. As we see the differential between the United States and what employers invest in their employees versus here Canada invest in employees, I think there's a little bit of a gap that needs to be narrowed. We need to focus on that, creating policies to create jobs, encourage private sector investment again, but maintain a very strong social fabric. I think, as we've seen through COVID-19, having a universal healthcare system that we have in Canada, I think is an advantage to us. I think it's worked out very, very, very well. And again, something that we should be all proud of. Having the income supports for seniors that we have, the GIS, the OAS, the CPP model that we've had, the measures that we brought in, the 10% boost to GIS, the other measures for the GIS earnings exemption that we changed, the suggestions for the CPP survivors benefit increase to be changed. A lot of good work there, the CPP expansion that was done. So I think we have a number of targeted programs in place, along with a universal healthcare system that we should be proud of. When we go to the doctor, they don't ask us how much we make, right? And I think that's something that program there is a really an advantage to Canada and a benefit to Canadians. So again, to answer your first question, I think a robust, competitive economy creating good middle class jobs is the best alleviator of poverty. At the same time, having a strong safety net for those Canadians that do need the assistance, that do need assistance from time to time, is definitely needs to be in place.
Angela?
Thank you. So I agree that a healthy economy kind of sustains itself, right? Once you have an economy with good jobs, then people are able to get those. But we're in a situation right now where there aren't a lot of jobs out there. How do we get that going? What do we need to do in order to make that happen? And there's a concept in economics called unmet demand. And that's where people don't have enough money to pay for the things they would like to buy. Like where we're concerned about this now is obviously where people are not able to meet their basic needs. They're not able to pay for housing, for transit, for food, for school. So if you can get money into the hands of low-income people and they can spend that money in their communities, that's one of the best ways to support a local community. And there's lots of ways to do that. You can have increased minimum wages and improve labor standards so that jobs are good jobs, and those people then have more money to spend in their communities. You can have targeted income supports like the CERB. This has been one of the key benefits of the CERB, is that it has allowed people to continue to pay mortgages, rent, go shopping at the grocery store, and that has kept local communities afloat because that money was still flowing through the economy, and that's really important. So when we think about that, we think about how do we create jobs and include the people who are most at risk. So there's all kinds of training programs that you can do that we can think about how that's going to happen over the next year. What kind of training supports to retrain people into the in-demand jobs? Like, we're going to need a lot more personal support workers and a lot more educational assistance. And provincial governments have a role there in hiring more of those workers. So a lot of the workers that we need are actually public sector workers, cleaners, and then the other piece I think is housing. So the National Housing Strategy was sort of starting up and coming to roll out. So I'm really interested to see how that will respond to the current crisis. And if government supports do fall off, there's a big gap between EI and social assistance. So there's going to be a whole bunch of people who will be running down their assets, potentially losing houses if they don't have benefits, they can't find a job, and they're waiting to qualify for social assistance. So improving housing markets and the cost of housing at the low end for people is going to be a big issue in terms of economic stability for them.
Professor Lee?
I guess this is where I have to strongly disagree with Angela, and I'll explain why. A couple of comments were made, and I think you did made one comment, Yasmin, and I have to respectfully, gently disagree. You said the jobs aren't coming back. I want to remind everybody, pre-COVID, January of this year, we had the lowest unemployment rate in 70 years. And the problem is very simple. And I can say this because I have joined that club of over 65. There's too many of me and not enough of Angela, because the birth rate is way down. And that number is going to grow like crazy. We're going to go from 12% of the population over 65 to 25%. As one demographer put it, all of North America is going to look like Florida, but without the nice warm beaches. And so we are not facing a massive unemployment going forward. Once we get past COVID, we're going to be facing labor shortages. That's why I so strongly support immigration, by the way. The economy needs immigration, more immigration. So we don't have to worry about massive numbers of social programs to, quote, create jobs. We're going to have shortages of jobs. But to your point, I don't want to duck your overarching question. I think you can tell from my comments that I strongly oppose a guaranteed annual income. I do support social programs for those who need help. Of course, the targeted approach that we've done since, to give full credit, the name of this institute, it was Lester Pearson who created public health care in 1965. I was 12 years old. It was Lester Pearson that created Canada Pension and guaranteed annual income. He created almost the entire panoply of social infrastructure in this country. And I know there's this thesis going around, I read it in the media every day, that Canada is going to hell in a handcart and we're falling over the cliff and we're all starving to death. This is not true. We have an inequality index below the OECD average. We are doing better than many European countries. There is some people falling between the cracks, and yes, we have to help them, but we can't put in a guaranteed annual income on top of all of our social programs, as people have argued, and I've debated Angela on this previously on other programs, because the cost is staggering and we have to be mindful of the deficit. And for those who say the deficit be damned, remember, right now the markets are supporting these temporary deficits because they believe they're temporary. But if they believe that they're going to become structural and permanent, then I think we're going to be in a situation not that different from former Prime Minister Chrétien and Paul Martin in 1995. And so we have to keep an eye on the deficit. Yes, we have to be compassionate. Yes, we have to help people that need help. But a guaranteed annual income has been estimated by both Professor Milligan at UBC, who has advised Prime Minister Trudeau, and Stephen Gordon at Laval, that it'll run 25% of GDP. And I don't understand why we want to give people like Angela or me a check for 20 or 25,000 on top of our salary. It just doesn't make any sense at all. Target it to the people who need help, not to the comfortable, affluent, privileged people like us.
And therefore, I'll now change channels, and I think I probably have 5 minutes, Andrew?
Yeah, just
okay.
That.
So now let's talk about jobs and labor market shortage. In my riding, I have so many innovative businesses that have worked hard and the government has invested. These are going forward. The environment is a critical issue and the environment will contribute to economic development. What are your thoughts? Because I know that the green economy will require people to retrain. So Professor Lee, what are universities doing about getting students ready into those type of jobs? Because those are the very innovative jobs that are making money. In my writing, I can see that some of the businesses has hired lots of people, but these are in the edge technology. And so you sit there and say, how do you move forward? What can universities do in participating in creating that job market, the stop the gap between the jobs and the requirements?
I mean, that's an excellent question. I didn't expect you to ask that. I thought you were going to ask what government can do. I didn't expect you to ask what universities can do. But and I'm not the representative, the voice of universities, but I can say, just because I'm in the middle of it as an academic, that there is an incredible number of programs at not just my university, other universities. Every faculty is developing new degree programs, new specializations in green and engineering, on focusing on retrofitting and moving to a zero carbon. So all the major universities that I'm aware of are really innovating tremendously in developing new programs in engineering, in business schools, and economics, and the social science, looking at different aspects. So I think that there's a lot of things happening there. And of course, government has been, both the federal government and the provincial governments have been really pushing this along. And there's things that can be done, obviously, especially in the transportation sector and the housing writ large sector. And I mean by housing now, buildings, not just the 15 million buildings that we live in individually, according to StatsCan, but all those government buildings and university buildings and office buildings and so forth, because there's a huge retrofit job that's going to be necessary if we ever want to get to a carbon-free economy, because there's so many buildings. They have a long life. They've been built to last a long time, and we're not going to tear them all down. We're going to have to retrofit them. So there's the universities are innovating across Canada and developing new programs to develop the trained workforce of the future. And there's obviously a huge demand out there. I agree with you.
Angela, from a labor perspective, what do you see going forward? Because I was part of the government operations, and we were doing greening government. So Angela, where do you see labor force intersect, and how can, even if there's a government intervention, what can it do?
Absolutely. So lots of building trades are including green training in their apprenticeship training series. So you're seeing mechanical insulators are looking at the impact of them doing a good job and understanding how much that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And they're finding that's really useful for workers taking pride in their work, and they end up building and doing a better job of the retrofits when they have that training and that background understanding. And I think that's really important to give workers a sense of pride in what they're doing, because often when we talk about the green transition, there's a bit of an implication that blue collar workers are dirty jobs, right? But really they're the key to greening the economy. This is what we're going to need. Is we're going to need retrofitting. We're going to need workers that are trained. And two things that government can do absolutely is, first of all, lead by example and get all of their buildings updated. And second of all, regulations around a green building code. Just make it mandatory so that it has to be done, and let us figure out how to do it.
And Francisco, how do you balance the private sector investments and government to ensure that going forward we do meet our GHG targets?
That's a great question, Yasmin. I think when we talk about climate change and we talk about programs, for me, it's about lowering greenhouse gas emissions. And I think you can do that in partnership between the private sector and government, whether it's what Angela or Professor Lee commented in terms of retrofitting buildings. For example, a government can put in place a scrappage program for older vehicles that are on the road, and you can lower that. It would be take out a big chunk of vehicles that emit a lot of GHGs because they're just older style of vehicles. They're not as using the modern technology. Apprenticeship programs for individuals, which we've done a considerable amount with the building trades unions, with various unions across Canada, making sure we're turning out those workers, and also putting in place the standards, building standards in place for buildings that are being constructed. You can now utilize wood frame construction for multiple story buildings, replacing concrete. From what my understanding is that can lower the greenhouse gas emissions. A number of programs in place, and we also can't lose sight of the fact in terms of lowering greenhouse gas emissions. It's also not only lowering greenhouse gas emissions here in Canada, but doing it on a global basis. So you may be able to locate a plant in Canada, a steel facility in Canada, which may emit GHGs, but it may replace a very bad, if I can use the term, steel plant overseas, which is a considerably worse emitter of GHGs. So doing those type of smart investments, government and the private sector working together. If you look at Germany, they seemed, I've been following them throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. They seem to be, the government and the private sector seem to be working very closely in terms of what type of economy they want coming out of the pandemic. And I think we can read about what they're doing and take some few lessons there and utilize it. We're doing a lot of good things, but I'm a big believer in looking around and seeing what's working and looking at that and seeing if we can adopt it to our economy.
Absolutely.
So Andrew, do I hand it over to you to get questions?
Okay, thank you, Yasmin Ratanzi, for guiding us through the issues thus far. We've got a few questions coming in online, and let me ask those of the panel. So the first is with regard to Indigenous peoples. What measures can government and the private sector take to help Indigenous peoples on reserve and in the cities following COVID? I'll start with you, Francesca.
Oh, thank you. That is a phenomenal question. There is no relationship more important than obviously a nation to nation relationship. Continuing those investments that we've done over the last 5-6 years, I think it's nearly $30 billion that's been invested into Indigenous communities across Canada, both on reserve and off reserve, is so important. We know there's gaps in terms of investments, in terms of education and so forth, that we're trying to make sure that these gaps don't exist anymore, and making sure those outcomes are the same. So those continuing to make those investments, whether it's in apprenticeship training, whether it's through education, whether it's through the agreements, lifting boil water advisories and so forth, those are critical. The Indigenous population, for example, in Saskatchewan is very young. And Professor Lee talked about demographics and getting people in the labor force. It's going to be critical that those Indigenous youth in Saskatchewan and other provinces across Canada get those skills and the opportunities to obtain those skills to be able to participate in the labor force and live the fulfilling lives that all Canadians want to live. And I think that's my humble view. I'll stop there and turn it over to Angela, I guess.
Angela, you're next. Go for it.
Oh, good.
Great. Yeah, I think investments in clean water, I think working with communities on a government to government basis, a nation to nation basis, and making the investments that the communities see they need. And obviously there's a huge urban population for Indigenous people. So looking at the questions of criminalization of poverty, racism, and police forces, I think that's going to be big. So it's a giant issue.
Okay, Ian Lee.
Really important.
I'll be very brief because I agree with what's been said. We are facing, as I've already said, labor shortages in the future. One solution is increased immigration. The other solution is to increase the participation rate of those groups with lower participation rates. Women are most obviously have lower participation rates. Another very important segment of Canadian society are Indigenous peoples, and they are a vast untapped resource, and we need more young people in the workforce. I just can't emphasize that enough. We are not looking at massive unemployment going forward 5-10 years. This COVID situation is very temporary. 2 or 3 years from now, we're going to be back to 5%, maybe 4% unemployment, because more every day, there's thousands and thousands of people turning 65 and retiring and exiting the workforce, a lot more than are entering the workforce. So we need to get every person out there, women, Indigenous people, other people who are not in the workforce, into the workforce. So this is what government should be focused on.
Okay, before I go to the next one, just a quick question to all three of you. Ian Lee, you mentioned the next 3 or 4 years. Do you all think that we've got a rather tough winter ahead of us in terms of having to be very careful, distance and all that, and very slow economic recovery over the next 6 months, say? Ian, I'll start with you.
I'll keep it short because I want to hear everyone else's answers. Yes, we do. We have to continue social distancing. I think it's a good thing that the universities have mostly closed down and gone virtual education. And we're going to have to, be very prudent. And I think we're going to see a very strong increase in bankruptcies in the fall and winter because small and mid-sized businesses were hanging on, thinking that it was going to turn around, and they were, tapping in friends and family to get more capital into the business. And I think they're going to run. Some of these businesses are going to run out of runway. The banks are going to cut them off, and we're going to see this is a short-term situation, but it's nonetheless going to be very painful for those people that lose their jobs and those entrepreneurs that lose their entire life savings when we see these bankruptcies skyrocket in the small, mid-sized sector.
Yeah. Angela McEwen?
Absolutely. I think we're going to see a secondary effect, as Ian said, where people were kind of running on empty and they're going to lose houses and businesses, and there's going to be some bankruptcies and some readjustments, which is going to be a drag on the whole economy and a personal crisis for the people who are feeling that. So I think it's going to take longer than we think. That we think it'll probably be more than 6 months. I would say a year or two. It's going to be a difficult transition out of the sector. And then I do agree with Ian that longer term, we're going to have labor shortages. But for the next 2 years, it's going to be a real challenge for people. And the more we can keep them from falling into situations where they owe a lot of money or they're really low, because there's also a mental health crisis that people are experiencing, right? So we have so much to overcome. We want to limit how bad this is for them so that they're able to come out of it better on the other side and rebound more quickly. We want to build some resiliency into the system.
Okay, and Francesco, just quickly, if you got a thought on that.
I think it's going to be very sector specific. You've had some sectors that are doing quite well and are doing quite well, and if you look at the GDP, we've recovered a large chunk of what was shut down in February. You've had other sectors where, so for example, the tourism sector, some of the airlines aren't forecasting a return to, you look at the airports, a return to normal levels or levels of passenger traffic, not for 2, 3, 4 years. It really depends. So you're going to have some sectors continue that are going to need, frankly, ongoing supports. The rental relief program or the queues that we put in place to December, and those are going to be critical. I think we as citizens obviously need to heed our public health officials, so we need to continue the social distancing, good hand washing, and good hygiene on all kind of good things. I do agree with Angela and Professor Lee. I think a couple of years out, we're still going to face the same issues of demographics, of ensuring our birth rate doesn't decline, and we can put in place measures to encourage more getting immigration restarted. And I know the Minister of Immigration is very, very focused on that and doing a great job. So a lot of things that we need to do. But yes, if I can use one example for the restaurant business, a lot of restaurants have been able to put patios up and increase their capacity to the like because of that. But come in a few weeks, a lot of those patios, unfortunately, due to the weather, will no longer be there. And if you can only have a certain amount of capacity in your restaurant, we know margins in restaurants aren't, the best at times, and it's a very, very very competitive business. We're going to have to make sure that policies are in place to help them survive, because it's going to be a very, very challenging fall for them.
Okay, next question. We need to reduce our emissions and, very importantly, adapt our society to being climate resilient. In the economics of recovery, how does Canada most effectively recover to being a climate resilient society? Ian Lee, start with you.
I'm an incrementalist. I'm not a radical revolutionary type. And so I think that the policies that have been adopted are going to go forward. I've already said retrofitting. I have no investments, by the way, none whatsoever. I have no conflict of interest. But I do look at the stats, and I do know that there's an awful lot of houses. I've just retrofitted my house, so I have a personal interest in this. I ripped out my walls, no kidding. I had them rip down the drywall on the inside to expose the studs to spray and spray foam. And I'm telling you, it makes an enormous difference. The reduction in your bill is just phenomenal, but it's not cheap. And I'm one house. There's 15 million homes in Canada belonging to us, and that's high rise and low rise. That's a lot of houses to be retrofitted, and we're not even talking all the public schools and the high schools and the hospitals and the office buildings. So there's a lot of work to do there. Encouraging the shift to electric cars, and I think a carbon tax is inevitable. It's necessary and inevitable. I know it's unpopular.
So I'll start. Francesco, you've got half a minute.
We've adopted a number of measures to lower GHGs. I think we need to continue to pursue those measures. Hitting net zero by 2050, I believe that's the year. Very important for us to do. We need to get the remaining of coal generated electricity offline. We know coal is the largest, if I'm not mistaken, generator of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, or one of. So there are a number of policies. A scrappage program. I'm just throwing a few ideas on older vehicles, retrofitting. So there are a number of programs that can be adopted, and these programs have been adopted before. We put a price on pollution. Very important to lower GHGs. We've done a number of things. There's more to do for sure, and definitely a lot of good ideas out there.
Okay, thank you. And Angela McEwen, last word to you.
it has to be urgent. It can't be incremental. We are at the point where it has to be done now. So we know that if we put in, as governments, we come together and we implement something, it takes a couple of years for it to roll out, right? Stuff doesn't happen on a dime. So if we're talking about doing it gradually, it's not going to be done until 2050. We've been talking about this since I was in high school, and it's definitely been a long time since I was in high school. So we've tried the incremental approach. It has not worked. We absolutely have to rip the Band-Aid off and get it done. It's a priority. During the last election, talking to voters, it was absolutely a priority for them. So whatever you're doing, invest the money now, because it will save us money in the future. And so if you're talking about a return on investment, if you're talking avoiding costs, if you're talking about building a society that we all want to live in, it doesn't matter how much money we can spend. Everybody should read The Deficit Myth. I'm not necessarily an MMTer, but yeah, if the future us 20 years from now could lend us money in order to do this change and make our society healthier, they would do that. So we should borrow the money now and spend it, whatever it costs, to build public transit, free public transit that's electric. We should build renewable energy, green energy, and we should absolutely retrofit all the buildings in Canada.
I think we need another session on that last question.
Yes.
Yasmin Ratanzi, do you have a last comment?
I'd like to thank everybody for their thoughts. You know, the speech from the throne would appreciate getting your feedback on what it is that we should have as a road forward. And Angela, to your point, the Martin government had created Kyoto, and Dion had come up with a green shift. But what happens is when governments don't believe in the climate, and they are climate deniers, you have a problem. And that's what happened in Ontario, where the cap and trade was eliminated, and the universities and schools lost $3 billion. So with that, I like to thank all of you, and I hope, Andrew, we can take some of the thoughts and feed it into our speech from the throne.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you, Francesco and Yasmin, for being part of this discussion, because you know, you will be part of those discussions in the government, so please take those forward. Thank you as well to Angela McHugh and Ian Lee for your very thoughtful comments. This has really been incredibly informative and thoughtful discussion. Thank you for sharing the time with us. I just want to say quickly to the audience, thank you for your participation. We've got a number of webinars coming up in the weeks ahead dealing with our theme of COVID and beyond, so please visit our website for information on that. On Monday, we have a session on taxation of the global corporation. So please join us then, and for others later on. And again, thank you to all our guests and our co-moderator. Since the audience can't hear us, since we can't hear them clapping, I'm going to ask you to clap for each other as we go out.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.